Yes.
I like these talks. The observation I want to make, and it does become a question, is having having had the experience of being the communication director for ICON for a while, I had to deal with a lot of issues like protein fibrillation study and its association to Alzheimer's, which got picked up by the press, and then we had to see how powerful the linkage was and whether the press was exaggerating the impacts. We had the same problem with Ken's study when we were examining the mesothelioma reference. I mean, I got actually preliminary drafts of the abstract, which had asbestos listed 4 times in the first draft of the abstract, right? And this just, was incredibly problematic, because, I mean, the only reason they were using the asbestos reference, well, it was as reference, right? Because you wanted to reference the mesothelioma data sets that are out there. And when you're doing your presentation, and I love you dearly, and when you were doing your presentation, I mean, when you got to one point, you were talking about the different stages of development for the Medaka, you again went, and this is a lot like the thalidomide situation. And I think my question is to the bench scientists. I mean, this as a person who has to, I'm not going to use the word, as a person who has to spin a lot of the stuff you do, what happens over and over and over again is I find in the scientific rhetoric this, I'm not sure it's controllable. I'm not sure if it's drawn from the field, and I'm not sure if it's what the motivation is, but this happens over and over again. And when the media picks it up, they don't look at any of the data at all. What they do is they chase this metaphor for all it is possibly worth. And my question is, so it's to you, and it's to James, and it's to Christine, it's to all of you. Like, I mean, what do we do? How can we get this dealt with properly? I mean, we sort of, from my perspective, I see it as a problem, but it might not be a problem from your perspectives.
No, I think it is a problem, but I think why I do it,
and I think I do it almost subconsciously, is because you're trying to explain complex things to people that may not have a good understanding of it. And so the easiest way for us to do that is to reference something that they know about. But I'm sorry?
It's a shorthand.
Yeah, it is. And maybe that's part of this whole communication process, is we need to become more aware of doing that.
Have you seen a scientific heuristic? I mean, there seems to be a heuristic that the scientific community defaults to.
Yeah.
Their own little shortcut. My concern is that the shortcut often is a very extreme example.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's the question. But I think it's, in effect, a topic that could do with some molecular toxicological research. I think there's actually science behind it. I think you look for analogies. I must say, as you were saying it, I had the opposite reaction to David. I was saying, well, you shouldn't keep secret the fact that you've learned that there's roughly the same number of genetic changes in your nanotubes or no, it was the other, it was gold, wasn't it?
Gold,
yeah, and asbestos. You shouldn't keep that secret, right?
I don't think
But I think it's really a question whether or not the impulse you had to make the comparison actually means something. How significant is it for asbestos that there are 55 genetic changes? Do you have a comparison substance that you and everybody else thinks is benign that would have that many changes? I guess my thought is maybe what you need is more information rather than suppressing.
Oh, I'm not saying, I mean, I just think the reference usually is something with a high negative valence. Right?
Yeah.
So for lack of a better description of it, the term they choose is, let's find one with a real high negative valence, and it's the motivation behind that that's interesting.
Now, for the mesothelioma, right, I mean, that one, I mean, where else do you see mesothelioma? It seemed to me that was not arbitrary.
But they didn't even use lung tissue when they did the study, right? I mean, it's true. I mean, and the asbestos was lung tissue, right? That's it. Then it wasn't even cancer. Well, the technical part of it was was incomplete. But James wants to say something.
Go ahead.
No, I wanted to address a point, but I also had a question
Yeah.
for Tara as well. Now, I think to address this point, as toxicologists, we have to compare new things to what we know have caused disease in the past. And your point's very well taken, too. We also need to use something that's relatively benign, that's either a particle or a nanoparticle, because there's a whole spectrum. So we have to draw on what we know, but David's point is good, too. You don't want to be alarmist and say something is a mesothelioma when it's not. It's
Because the inference
it's
they're getting
inflammatory.
is- yeah.
It could turn into a mesothelioma, or it might not turn into a mesothelioma,
Right.
and you just don't know. I mean, I'll try to address some of this too. So I'm gonna do the same thing Tara's doing in just a few minutes. I'm gonna bring up the word asbestos too, and I think we have to ask the question, such as, is our nanotubes the next asbestos? And the answer could either be yes, or it could be no, or it could be somewhere in between.
But I think what you're saying is these analogies come across as, okay, well, carbon nanotubes are like asbestos, just by saying it.
With that, what you're looking at then is the word asbestos, since it has been regulated and has had this already historical context in society as being only negative, you have completely left out and omitted the possibility of these nanotubes being benign or being positive in some instances.
But on the
Because
other
with
hand,
the analogy of relating them, you link them to this other mental leap, this inference that people make through the analogy and metaphor.
I guess without the analogy, would it mean anything? And what does it mean if I just say, how do you take that meaning different if I just say, well, carbon nanotubes do this? Without any analogy to something else.
I wish
It's
Deidre was
difficult.
here. Deidre would say, there are frames and there are frames. Just what it is.
I don't know, I'm just saying, I don't know the answer,
Yeah, I
I'm
don't
just
know what
asking.
the answer is either.
Well,
Yeah.
I think, go ahead.
Yeah, I haven't yet heard anybody invoke the precautionary principle, so let me invoke it. If you have any sense of precaution whatsoever, then the analogy that you're suggesting is a kind of heuristic or generative analogy that presents some possibilities that really ought to be explored. So I think the burden of proof is on the producer of nanomaterials to demonstrate to the best of their ability that they're reasonably safe, rather than to play down any concerns about inflammatory rhetoric. I'm all for inflammatory rhetoric to the extent that it maps out some worst-case scenarios that ought to be investigated.
And I'll play apologist for the toxicologists a little bit in this. I don't think in most of the cases that the analogs themselves are per se inflammatory. When you make the asbestos comparison, well, asbestos has certain trigger effects in terms of the consciousness. You're very careful to talk about the differences and distinctions. It may be the same number, but it's different. Different genes are being affected, the way it works differently, and so on. But we heard a little bit about this yesterday, and we all know what's happening in terms of science reporting in the United States. It wasn't terribly good to start with, and now people who specialized in science reporting are becoming non-existent. And vast majority of people don't understand the difference between correlation causation when they read the literature, and they see something like that, and, news media has an interest in that which attracts attention. That which is, so the news is not, well, it might or it might not, but that it could. And so when it translates from the question of the toxicological study into mass media, it becomes, well, we need to be cautious and concerned and think about whether or not there is actually this kind of similar relationship into a story of this could kill you. Yeah. Which isn't factually wrong, but the frame issue in place here, because alarmism is a primary mechanism for drawing eyeballs to any media outlet that then wants to sell those eyeballs for advertising revenue, that translation issue is a major kind of function in the way that public information is distributed in this country through these outlets that require that kind of a frame in order to draw attention to news, produces an enormous